Hello and welcome. My name's Alan Deacon. I'm the current chair of Project Bohoeffer, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome so many of you to the third seminar in our series on Bonhoeffer's legacy for today. There's just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we start. We anticipate that there'll be around half an hour for questions and discussion after the two speakers. And if you would like to ask a question, you're warmly invited either to post that question in the chat or simply indicate that you would like to ask a question, and I'll come back and invite you to do so. One factor that you might want to bear in mind is that with the agreement of our speakers, the seminar is being recorded. So if you don't want to be on the recording, then obviously stay with the video off and just post your question in the chat. But it would be helpful to give an indication of what you want to ask about, because it might be possible to group questions to avoid hopping about a bit in the discussion. But with that, as I say, it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you, and particularly to welcome our main speaker, Ellie. Dr. Ellie McLauglin is tutor in theology at Ripon College, Cuddesdon, and an associate member of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oxford. She's a very active and very welcome trustee of Project Bohoeffer. She's written widely on disability theology and Bonhoeffer and the death of God debate, but her central contribution has been the book she published in 2020 called Unconscious Christianity in Bonhoeffer's Late Theology. And it's that which she'll be drawing on in her presentation to us today. So it's a very warm welcome, and over to you, Ellie.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alan, and all my fellow trustees at Project Bohoeffer for inviting me to share some of my research this afternoon. Thank you to everyone for being here. It's always really encouraging when people want to come and hear about things that one has spent quite a long time mulling over in the solitude of one's study. And thank you very much to Rowan, who's agreed to come and give some responses to some of the things I'm going to be saying this afternoon. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. What we're going to be spending some time thinking about today is primarily this concept of unconscious Christianity that Bonhoeffer developed during the Second World War. We'll be looking at the years 1940 to 1944. We'll also briefly spend time thinking about this idea of the world come of age that also is developed during that period, because I think that concept really helps us to understand unconscious Christianity, and it also helps us to understand the other idea that is often paired alongside unconscious Christianity, which is religionless Christianity. So we'll be looking at those, and then we'll take a bit of time to look at religionless Christianity and unconscious Christianity together to see how they might be similar or how they might differ from each other. And then at the end, I'll make some suggestions about how I think these concepts might be helpful to us today. I'm not, sadly, going to spend much time talking about the very, very interesting life story that Bonhoeffer has. I just wanted to give you a picture there of the family group. He's one of a very large family. He's the extremely blonde one with the bowl cut in the middle beside his mother there. If you're interested in seeing some other photos of Bonhoeffer throughout his life and the different contexts he found himself in, I really heartily recommend this book, Bonhoeffer, A Life in Pictures. It's really wonderful. It's available in English and in German. I can give you more details on that book later if you're interested. So let's head right into unconscious Christianity and some lots of squiggly words on the page there. Bonhoeffer has very hard to read handwriting, as I found out during the course of my research. Now, unfortunately for me, Bonhoeffer only mentions unconscious Christianity explicitly 4 times in all of his writings. And these are 2 of the manuscripts in which he mentions it. So my work in this research has been to try to piece together a definition of unconscious Christianity based on these 4 texts, and also taking into consideration his other writing of this period, where I contend unconscious Christianity is very much playing out in his mind, even though he doesn't mention it explicitly. So the first text on the left hand of your screen there is the last page of an essay that he wrote in 1940, autumn 1940, that is going to be part of this very large, chunky book, his Ethics. It's one of the essays that is collected in his Ethics collection. This essay is called The Ultimate and Penultimate Things. And what's happening here towards the end is he's talking about a group of people that he calls good people. And one of the things he says about these good people is that they are trying to value and hold on to what he calls the penultimate. So that which is before, which is worldly, as opposed to the ultimate, which you could think of as that which is beyond this life. So he talks about the penultimate, the worldly, and he's saying there are some good people who are trying to value these things and not simply skipping over life in this world to kind of grasp life in the hereafter. Right at the bottom of this page, it's very indistinct, but you can see a marginal comment right at the bottom here. And that first line of that marginal comment says, Unbewusstes Christentum, unconscious Christianity. So he seems to be making a link here between unconscious Christianity and these ideas around valuing the penultimate and being good people. On the right-hand side of your screen, you've got a page from Bonhoeffer's unfinished novel, about which we'll hear more soon. He describes his goal in writing a novel, which he never gets to finish. He describes his goal in doing this as a rehabilitation of the bourgeoisie as we know it in our families, particularly from a Christian perspective. So that's what he's trying to do here. And in the novel, as we'll see, there are some characters that are referred to as unconscious Christians. We'll come back to that. The other two manuscripts in which unconscious Christianity gets a mention are, first of all, on the left of your screen, you've got 2 pages. These are, in fact, a letter, 2 pages of the same letter, and you can see his signature in the middle there at the end of the last paragraph of the letter. You can maybe see on the left-hand side that he's underlined some parts of his letter. This is a letter to Bethge written in summer 1944. And this is the line he's underlined. Your formulation of our theological theme is very clear and simple. The question how there can be a natural piety is at the same time the question about unconscious Christianity that preoccupies me more and more. So we can see that he's clearly got this idea of unconscious Christianity, what it is, how he can articulate it, what its links are or might be to this idea of a natural piety, a natural holiness. All of these ideas are clearly at the forefront of his mind while he's in prison. And then this final manuscript is very much just a collection of jottings. And what they are, in fact, is some preliminary notes for a book that he planned to write. So in Letters and Papers from Prison, another chunky book, if you'd like to have some wintertime reading, he develops from some preliminary notes, some then more developed notes, which are also in the text, on this book that he's planning to write after, at this point, hopefully after he's freed from prison. So what these particular notes are saying, Unbewusstes Christentum is that very, very first cluster of letters at the top left. And then what he's saying in that little right-hand column is, the left does not know what the right is doing, which is a reference to Matthew 6, verse 3. And then underneath that, you might be able to see MT 25, Matthew 25. And then underneath that, wissen nicht was beten, not knowing what to pray. And then the last line is motto, Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you, from Mark 10:51. And we're going to be coming back to this cluster of notes again a bit later. So during my research, I found that Bonhoeffer's understanding of unconscious Christianity didn't stay the same over the course of his thinking about it. And his ideas really develop along with his changing circumstances. So whilst he's writing novel, for example, which is very much set in his own family context, he writes about, under a different name, he's writing about his own family most of the time in his own home. he suggests in this text that Christians are very likely to be members of his own social class, the Bürgertum. He really thinks that that's probably where these people will be coming from. But later on, there's no indication that he still thinks that. So his ideas are very much in flux on unconscious Christianity. Now, what I've done for this afternoon, because we don't have time to look at all 4 of these manuscripts, I've decided to concentrate on the novel and on the notes that he made for the outline of his book, because they show different facets of his continually developing thought on unconscious Christianity. So let's briefly look then at his fiction, where the novel is to be found. So this is in this book, and this is the last book I'll be touting for this afternoon, Bonhoeffer, Fiction from Tegel Prison. It's not often discussed in Bonhoeffer scholarship, but it is really, really worth the read. If you haven't read it yet and you're interested in what Bonhoeffer wrote while he was in prison, I really recommend it. In this volume are collected an incomplete play, an incomplete novel. So he does 2 attempts at literary expression and he doesn't finish either of them. And then he does complete a short story. This story is sometimes known as Farewell, Comrade. We also have, really interestingly, another few lines of a 4th literary text, which either he just never completed anything more than 4 lines, or it's been lost. We don't know. So in novel, which is the bit of fiction we're going to concentrate on today, as I said, he's talking about this large family who resemble his own family a lot. They're called the Braque family. And we are zooming in on their teenage son, Christoph Braque, and his friend, Ulrich Carstensen. They're having a conversation at one point in the novel where Ulrich is giving Christoph an account of a recent school trip that Christoph has not been able to go on. So Ulrich is filling him in on everything that happened. And Ulrich tells Christoph about the bad behavior of one of their fellow pupils, some of their fellow pupils, and in particular, of a boy called Meyer, who's in fact now just been expelled from the gymnasium because he keeps failing his graduation exams. And the boys together, these teenage boys, are trying to think about what causes such bad behavior, because they realize that not all the pupils who are behaving badly have kind of started behaving badly altogether, but, quote, it's always just a few big wheels and the rest tip right over. Now, of course, Bonhoeffer is writing at the height of the Nazi regime, imprisoned by the Nazi regime. He's thinking about group behavior, people following along from leaders who are leading them into bad behavior. We could be making lots of parallels here, of course, but for now, we'll just stick with his text in novel. So in discussing the roots of this problem, these teenage boys arrive at an analysis of Meyer's particular situation that points to a more general societal problem. And they talk about how Meyer's mother, who's a seamstress, and therefore not a member of this rather more wealthy and self-confident class of people, his mother is so nervous of officials that she teaches her son to have a great respect for what they call all the official somebodies. And Christoph concludes, so is it any wonder, because of this upbringing, is it any wonder if Herr Archibald Meyer, graduating senior, thinks that the only proper thing to do is to behave like an aspiring government official by going out drinking, picking up a girl, if possible one from a cabaret, etc., etc., and last but not least, flunking his graduation exams and making his mother miserable. We could say a lot today about aspiring government officials and their behavior, but we'll park that for now. So this is their conversation, and they're thinking about, who's responsible for this type of behavior? And Christoph places the responsibility for this sort of false ambition in certain people at the feet of the upper classes, because the rest of the population look up to them and want to emulate them. And the reason that this upper class inspires such a misplaced sense of ambition in others is that itself, it is decayed. So the blame, interestingly, does not only lie with what he calls this bunch of rotten, obsequious lackeys who make up the upper class, but also with the few decent members of this upper class who, quote, withdraw into themselves because they're repulsed by this vacuous, conceited society. So Bonhoeffer is doing two things here. He's reproving the upper class who set bad examples for others to emulate, but he's also putting the blame at the feet of the people in the upper class who have kind of washed their hands of the situation and don't want to get involved and try to act responsibly and show a good example. So from this analysis, it's plain to Christoph that Germany needs a new, genuine upper class, and that the responsibility for such a renewal lies with members of the Bürgertum, such as himself and his family. And in the Q&A, we can talk about Bonhoeffer's view of class because it is very much of its own time. Now, Ulrich, his friend, cautions Christoph that they may not find themselves to be immune to what he calls the poison of ambition that they see at work in members of the lower classes. And in fact, he sees the lack of false ambition to be caused by something other than class. His own mother, he says, is the widow of a church organist and therefore not a member of the Bürgertum. Nevertheless, she doesn't cower before officials and her superiors, and Ulrich describes her in these terms. Though she's quite modest, she moves with freedom and confidence wherever she goes, without wanting to be something other than she is. When I ask myself where she gets that freedom, there's only one clear answer: from her Christian faith. So for Ulrich, Christian faith is that which prevents one from having false ambition and a false idea of oneself. He attributes contemporary evils to the fact that most people no longer have a Christian faith that will allow them to be free of false ambition. And he suggests that for a renewal of the Bürgertum to come about, its members will have to have a Christian faith. What's really interesting is that he makes a differentiation between being religious and having a Christian faith, because Christoph asks him in this text, so you think we must have more religion if we want to be in responsible positions someday? And Ulrich answers, I think we have to be Christians. Now, Ulrich's conclusion leads to a problem. What is to be made of the current members of the Bürgertum who do not go to church or exhibit any sort of religious behavior? Christoph asks Ulrich why his own parents, who only say grace because of their youngest son, and apart from that are totally, as far as he can tell, not religious at all, are not infected by what he calls the spirit of false ambition. Ulrich answers, that's because, without knowing it and certainly without talking about it, in truth, they still base their lives on Christianity, an unconscious Christianity. Ulrich's recognition of unconscious Christianity in the Bracher parents solves the problem of why some people who are not consciously Christian are able to avoid false ambition. It's the Bracher parents' unconscious Christianity that allows them to avoid it. In this text, therefore, Christianity, whether conscious or unconscious, is portrayed as that which allows the individual to have a genuine view of herself, quote, without wanting to be other than she is. Unconscious Christianity is what causes the Bracher parents to be immune from the temptation of careerism and titles. And Christoph examines this aspect of their character and finds it to be the same as that of Ulrich's mother, the seamstress, the widow of the church organist, who is immune because of her Christian faith. So from this conversation and from other character descriptions that appear in this novel, we can draw a definition of unconscious Christianity from this text, which is that unconscious Christianity, like conscious Christianity, allows the subject to perceive himself as he really is, and thus not to harbour false ambition. Now, this passage suggests that at this point, Bonhoeffer thought primarily of unconscious Christians as being members of the Bürgertum, as in the text, interestingly, the members of the lower classes who are Christian are consciously Christian. And this differentiation points to the idea that Christianity is part of the culture that the Bürgertum have inherited, but of which they're no longer consciously aware. So we'll park this definition of unconscious Christianity from the fiction there for now, and we'll move on to notes 2. So this tiny fragment of text on the right hand of your screens there, that is the basis for the second chapter of the book that Bonhoeffer intended to write. Now, I was just saying before that the first couple of things that he mentions in that cluster of notes are to do with the Gospel of Matthew. And Bonhoeffer references 2 passages from Matthew's Gospel in the notes that we're looking at now. Matthew 6, particularly verse 3, but it's helpful to have verses 3 and 4 here. So, but when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And so here Jesus's message is that good actions, in this case almsgiving, must be so secret and hidden that even the givers of alms should be unaware of what they're doing, right? So oblivious must they be of their good deeds that their left hand must not know what their right hand is doing. So they should be unconscious of their righteous action. And the first few verses from Matthew 6, which surround these few verses, present the idea that reward from God is linked to whether righteous action is carried out correctly, i.e. in a hidden and, if possible, unconscious manner, or wrongly, i.e. publicly. The second passage that Bonhoeffer references in these notes is Matthew 25. Now, because of some underlinings and cross-referencing in Bonhoeffer's own Bible, it's extremely likely that the bit of Matthew 25 that he's putting in conversation with this bit of Matthew 6 are the verses 37 to 40, which reads, "Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me.'" So here we also have in this passage the idea that God's reward is related to righteous action and refers as well to whether it was done consciously or unconsciously. In the few verses referred to by Bonhoeffer in Notes 2, which is the name of that cluster of notes, it's referred to as Notes 2. The theme of righteous action is augmented by the idea that those who performed it were unaware that they were doing so. In these few verses, the righteous ask the king, "When was it that we saw you naked and clothed you?" And the king has told them that they've done so and is rewarding them accordingly, yet they themselves do not know about their righteousness. It's obvious that in these notes, Bonhoeffer links the idea of unconscious Christianity to those who are called righteous by Jesus, who have performed good actions and have either done so in secret or are not even aware of their good actions. Bonhoeffer develops this idea further in his outline for a book. So we've got Notes 2, the very scanty jottings, and then in that same collection of papers from prison, we have a couple of paragraphs that are the development of those notes towards a more fully formed set of ideas. So the few notes that we're going to look at next are part of his preparatory work for the book he planned to write later. So it's worth looking at a little excerpt from these slightly fuller notes here. So this passage is from the outline for the second chapter of the proposed book that he wanted to write. And this passage really gives us the most insight into his idea about unconscious Christianity during this period, although he doesn't use the actual term again. As we'll see when we read this quote in a second, Bonhoeffer links Jesus's question to the blind man, "What do you want me to do for you?" From Mark 10, with the idea of Jesus's being for others. He refers to Jesus several times in his work as the man for others. So here we go with this quote. "Who is God?" Bonhoeffer writes. "Not primarily a belief in God's omnipotence and so on. That is not a genuine experience of God, but just a prolongation of a piece of the world. Encounter with Jesus Christ. Experience that here there is a reversal of all human existence in the very fact that Jesus only is there for others. Jesus's being for others is the experience of transcendence. Only through this liberation from the self, through this being for others unto death, do omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence come into being. Faith is participating in this being of Jesus, becoming human, cross resurrection. Our relationship to God is no religious relationship to some highest, most powerful, and best being imaginable. That is no genuine transcendence. Instead, our relationship to God is a new life in being there for others through participation in the being of Jesus. Now, when we come to discuss religionless Christianity, you might want to remember this idea at the bottom here, that our relationship to God is no religious relationship, because he seems to be using that word religious in quite a derogatory way here. So hold on to that thought for later. So by reading notes 2, as Bonhoeffer's first jotting down of ideas that he continues to develop in this quote that's on the screen, we can see that Bonhoeffer links unconscious Christianity to an encounter with, and indeed a participation in, Jesus Christ, who is for others. This picture of unconscious Christianity that emerges from notes 2, read alongside this outline for a book, is one of righteous action, performed ideally without the subjects being aware of it. In Matthew 25, linked to the idea of unconscious Christianity by Bonhoeffer, those who perform righteous actions are called righteous by Jesus and are called to inherit the kingdom by the King. It seems, therefore, that Bonhoeffer thinks that those who perform righteous actions are called righteous and accepted by God. So this is a bit of a whirlwind tour through the kind of unconscious Christianity part of my research. But what then happened, to cut a very long story short, is that by looking at those 4 manuscripts that were on the screen and trying to figure out where else in Bonhoeffer's opus there were hints of unconscious Christianity and characters, the description of the characters in the novel, how they behaved, how could we draw on all of those things to try to present a suggestion of a definition of unconscious Christianity. Here's where I landed. Unconscious Christianity refers to the whole body of good people who have encountered Christ without being aware of it and do not self-identify as Christians. In addition, they may fulfill any of these 6 criteria. And the reason that there are different criteria that they may or may not fulfill is because Bonhoeffer's definition or kind of concept shifts over time. So it's never really a static, full definition. So there are these different criteria that seem to come and go over the course of his development of his idea. So firstly, to have faith without knowing it, to be selfless and participate in Jesus's being for others, to not seek to be other than what they are, to value the penultimate, which we might also call the worldly, to perform acts of faith without reflecting on them. And then right at the beginning of his development, they also seem to be members of the Revd. So having got this far with unconscious Christianity, let us just briefly now look at this idea of the world come of age. This is an idea that Bonhoeffer develops alongside his ideas of unconscious Christianity and religionless Christianity during his imprisonment. And this is really a key quote that we have on the screen. Human beings have learned to manage all important issues by themselves without recourse to working hypothesis God. Now, what does that mean? In his prison writings, Bonhoeffer is saying that for centuries, people in Europe have accepted what he calls the working hypothesis God. And he thinks at the time of writing that people are moving beyond this hypothesis. Now, working hypothesis God essentially means that people live their lives with the assumption that there is a God. And that this assumption, the existence of God, explains all the things we don't really understand about the world. Bonhoeffer's argument goes like this. Because God is only perceived as providing an explanation to questions which are beyond human knowledge, so as human knowledge increases, so the space which God may occupy diminishes, right? So you can imagine two concentric circles where the outer circle is fixed and is not going to be able to grow. And in the middle, you have human knowledge. And as human knowledge gradually expands, the outer circle, which is the space for God to be, gradually gets pushed tighter and tighter and thinner. And so Bonhoeffer is saying, we need to have an idea of God, have a knowledge of God, have an experience of God, which isn't just the God who answers the questions that we can't answer ourselves, because eventually we're going to get to the point where we can answer pretty much all the questions ourselves, and there'll be no more space for God. So he's going to be thinking about new forms of experiencing God, new forms of Christianity. And Bonhoeffer accepts this world come of age as a non-negotiable reality. It's not a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's just value neutral. It's kind of where humanity has got to in its development. And he uses the image of someone who has reached adulthood, who's reached maturity. That's kind of where our thinking has now got to. So hopefully this really brief outline of the idea of the world come of age may help to explain why, when it comes to religionless Christianity, Bonhoeffer is convinced that people in wartime Europe were ready to question things that hadn't been questioned before. So let's look at religionless Christianity. This really gets raised by Bonhoeffer in what's referred to often as the first theological letter to Bethge in his Letters and Papers from Prison, written on the 30th of April, 1944. This is when he introduces Bethge, and through Bethge, the whole world, with his concept of religionless Christianity. He writes, "If religion is only the garb in which Christianity is clothed, and this garb has looked very different in different ages, what then is religionless Christianity?" The question arises for Bonhoeffer because he's really devoured by other related questions. What is Christianity? Who is Christ actually for us today? These are also questions that he's asking his friend in this letter. And at the same time, he's starting to think, quote, "We are approaching a completely religionless age." So it's really important to note here that Bonhoeffer is not turning his back on Christianity, on Christ. Some interpretations, scholarly interpretations of Bonhoeffer in the 20th century suggested that during his time in prison, he had a crisis of faith and indeed lost his Christian faith, and that therefore we shouldn't take his prison texts too seriously because actually they're not the writings of a Christian theologian by this point. I would really want to refute that. He is not trying to say we shouldn't be Christian anymore. What he's wondering is, how will Christianity be expressed if our society, our culture just isn't ready to be religious anymore? What will Christianity look like? And what he's thinking about, you know, the possibility of getting rid of, or the possibility of it not really being relevant anymore, is the way that religious people often turn to God as a sort of deus ex machina, who will turn up and make everything all right in the end. So if you're familiar with Greek or Roman drama, any kind of Greek or Roman plays, you'll know that plots at the end are often resolved by a God who suddenly appears out of the, you know, the framework of the play, out of the decor or whatever. And the God appears and kind of plumps onto the stage and sorts out everyone's problems and provides a happy ending. This is where the phrase deus ex machina, the God out of the machine, comes from. So in a way, we can think about religionless Christianity as a Christianity without the human religious impulse to want a God who is going to show up and fix everything. Then, of course, the question is, if that's not God, the God who shows up and fixes everything, then who is Christ for us today? Religionless Christianity, suggests Bonhoeffer, would also entail what he calls non-religious interpretation of biblical concepts, making the Gospels understandable and pertinent to the religionless. And this will be particularly important for the society that Bonhoeffer sees emerging around him, that he describes in these terms. The age when we could tell people that, and by that he means who Christ is for us today, with words, whether with theological or with pious words, is past, as is the age of inwardness and of conscience, and that means the age of religion altogether. We are approaching a completely religionless age. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. Bonhoeffer thinks that increasingly people of his day and of his context simply don't have the religious vocabulary to understand what the Bible is about, and they don't want to have this religious framework anymore. So it's up to Christianity to find new, non-religious ways to interpret biblical texts for people so that they can understand that the Bible and Christ are still relevant to them, but just in a new way. Bonhoeffer is clear that religionless Christians continue to believe in Jesus Christ, in the Christian God, but without expecting God to be there as a stopgap or an immediate problem solver. Religionless Christians, for Bonhoeffer, should still pray, should still meet together for worship, and if you think of it as two sides of the same coin, they should be meeting to pray, and they should be also, the other side of the coin, doing justice in the world. Those are the two important things that he comes back to. So how might unconscious Christianity compare to religionless Christianity? Well, if we imagine an unconscious Christian and a religionless Christian, we might see quite a lot of similarities. Neither perform publicly Christian rituals, so they're not going out into public spaces and performing Christian rituals. And they don't possess what Bonhoeffer calls the religious habit of turning to God as a problem solver. They both do not want God to be a problem solver or a stopgap in their lives. But this stems from two very different motivations. So for the religionless Christian, it makes no sense to perceive God in this way, as such a perception does not tally with his view of reality and of his view of the place of God in the world. As for the unconscious Christian, it simply does not occur to her to perceive God as a stopgap because she has no conscious need or desire for God. Thus, outwardly, religious Christians and unconscious Christians can display similar behavior in terms of their rejection of religiosity, we might want to call it, but they do so for different reasons. Both, again, will engage with Christ, one consciously, the other, thinks Bonhoeffer, unconsciously. They also share a common approach to their interaction with the other human being, other people around them. They want to seek to alleviate the suffering of others. Now, again, this common action is not based on the same convictions. While the people in Matthew 25 that we were looking at earlier have no stated motivation for their actions, they're not purposefully setting out to help to feed the hungry and clothe the naked for any kind of faith conviction reason. They simply end up doing it. Religionless Christians seek to share others' suffering and relieve the suffering of others because of their desire to imitate or participate in Jesus's being for others. So different motivations for actions that on the surface will look very similar to each other. And I think an understanding of unconscious Christianity sheds some light on the concept of religionless Christianity. And that way they help us to understand the other, they both shed light on the other concept. Because unconscious Christianity shows that religionless Christianity is not the only valid form of Christian expression that Bonhoeffer envisages for the world after this war is over. Although Bonhoeffer places great weight on the shoulders of the religionless Christians, saying that they must keep alive the mysteries of faith and do justice and keep praying together, at the same time, they're not the only Christians that he thinks will be found in Germany after the war. He thinks there will be unconscious Christians also. So in a way, there's a pastoral care and sensitivity here for the religionless Christians, kind of suggesting that they are not the only people who are responsible for the survival of the Christian faith, because this burden is shared with others. So now to end, and I think I'll just stop sharing my screen so that I can, see some more of you. It'll be more fun. I want to suggest a couple of ways in which I think these concepts might be useful for us today. So first of all, I think there are two things to be said. Just the fact that Bonhoeffer is suggesting multiple forms of Christian expression that are valid. And it's important to underline here that he doesn't have a hierarchy between different forms of Christian expression. He's not saying one is better than the other. Really helps fight against the human tendency to have nice, neat categories. So I think humans, and this does not stop at the doors of the church, I think people within Christianity and the church also like this. We like to have neat compartments in which we can put people. We like to be able to delineate our boundaries very nicely and say, I know what you're like, and I know which church you go to, and I know what that means about you, and you're in and you're out, and here are my nice dividing lines. I think the fact that Bonhoeffer has these multiple categories of Christian expression helps to fuzzify, if I can use that word, helps to fuzzify our tendency towards really nice, neat boundaries. He's making us think, okay, do we know, how do we think we know who other people are, what they're really like? And it's a bit of a challenge to us, I think, to kind of want to categorize people all the time. I think there's another very important thing that has to be said here, is that it is extremely, there's a real danger in just accepting this concept of unconscious Christianity that we have from Bonhoeffer, from a very different time and place to our own. And I think it can be very dangerous if we just unthinkingly accept this category and apply it onto other people in a paternalistic or in a colonizing way. So to kind of say, oh, you don't think you're Christian, but I know you are really, and as if they're not competent enough to decide what their identity is for themselves. I think not only is that harmful, but also it really goes against the grain of Bonhoeffer's own theological and pastoral care for people, because he is so careful to not say to his readers, we need to get these unconscious Christians and we need to make them understand that they're part of the church. He's not saying that. In the very first text that we looked at, written in 1940, he does say that we can encourage people who don't self-identify as Christians, quote, move them toward confessing Christ. But he never says that again. So I don't think he's out there, tootling a trumpet saying, let's get these unconscious Christians converted, or recognizing who that they are really, in fact, Christians. He's very happy to have these different forms of expression and to just leave it at that. So that's a serious point to make. I think if we take seriously the possibility of unconscious Christianity, it can colour many of the questions that the church is now asking itself. Questions like, how fast is secularization taking place? How should self-identifying Christians understand people who don't profess any Christian faith, but who want to attend church services because they find that the music is beautiful? What should we think about belonging without believing? What does religionless Christianity help us think about believing without belonging? So I think those are some really helpful questions that these concepts help us to think through. And another point that I want to make is a really practical one. These ideas show that for Bonhoeffer, a characteristic of unconscious Christianity is that unconscious Christians behave in a compassionate way towards disadvantaged people. And in doing so, they engage with Christ. This aspect of unconscious Christianity could form the background to dialogue and cooperation between the church and other organizations seeking to uphold social justice. It could enable an engagement with society more broadly, highlighting Christianity's compassionate commitment to the disadvantaged and presenting this as a platform on which to build communal action against poverty and against discrimination. And this aspect of unconscious Christianity might also be interesting for those who are thinking about the relationship between human goodness and Christianity. When it comes to Christianity, to religionless Christianity, I think Bonhoeffer's related idea of non-religious interpretation of biblical concepts is extremely relevant for us now. If Christians want to continue to communicate the gospel, we need to find ways of doing so that make sense to the people who are listening. Culture and society are shifting, and how we talk about biblical concepts and ideas must shift as well. So those are just a few suggestions from me. I'm going to end there. Thank you very much to everybody for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Ellie. That was extremely clear and engaging. Thank you very much indeed. If we move straight to the discussant and then come back and for a general discussion, I think the old cliche that our next speaker knows no introduction is probably never more true, and I suspect he's heard that phrase a good few times before as well, and he's nodding yes. As everybody knows, Lord Williams was Archbishop of Canterbury from December 2002 to December 2012. He's subsequently been Master of Magdalen College and a very active crossbench peer in the House of Lords. Perhaps most relevant to this afternoon is that he was the external examiner of Ellie's PhD, presumably passed it, and has taken a very close interest in her work ever since. And we're absolutely delighted that he's able to join us this afternoon to discuss her ideas. It's a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. And thank you, Ellie, for a beautifully lucid account of really quite a complex subject. It was very good to be reminded of all the excellent content in that thesis all those years ago and in the book that came from it. So thanks very much for this and all the work you do. I shan't speak for very long. I just wanted to draw out a very few themes from what you've said and raise some questions which I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about. And the first point I want to make, I suppose, is picking up on some of what you said about the rather eccentric versions of and interpretations of Bonhoeffer that have been around over the years, that were very popular when I was a lad in the 1960s, which regarded Bonhoeffer essentially as some kind of liberal who, towards the end of his life, sensibly laid aside all that complicated, unnecessary Lutheran theology that he grew up with and turned into an ordinary 20th century sensible Anglophone person. Now, I don't believe that this mysterious transmutation actually happened, because, as you know far better than I do, the seeds of this late interest in, let's just call it unconscious faith or preconscious faith or whatever, the seeds are there right from the start of his work as a theologian. And as I thought about your topic, one idea that crossed my mind was that there's a sense in which Bonhoeffer's not very interested in Christianity. He's very interested in our encounter with Christ. And that, that is the heart of it. What happens as a result of that encounter is really pretty complicated and pretty diverse. But the one thing you can't say is that encounter with Christ equals what we know as Christianity, a system of belief or even a system of practice, though he does, I think, take it for granted that the encounter with Christ does generate a certain kind of practice, both devotional and ethical, but more of that in a moment. So I think that's something to bear in mind, isn't it? That from the beginning, that sense of encounter, or as you drew out, talking about his book outline in the letters and papers, encounter and participation, that's there from the beginning. It's there even in a very early work like Act and Being, and it's picked up very strongly in the Christology lectures in the early 1930s. So he's already saying that what matters in faith is not whether we can, as it were, sign up to something that's presented to us in the abstract. It's how we come to terms with the fundamental reality of our existence, which is, as you might say, having our noses pressed up against a reality that we cannot control or manage. And that sense of being up against a reality, an imperative, a challenge, up against something that obliges us to rethink who and what we are, that is at the heart of everything. And I think that's what really comes front and center then, doesn't it, in what he writes both about unconscious Christianity and about religionless Christianity. And of course you could say that that sense of encounter with the limit, the otherness of the real in God, in Jesus Christ, that's in a way more demanding than the conventional conditions of faith. It's not any kind of watering down in order to make it more palatable. Quite the contrary, it makes it a lot more difficult and a lot more strange. And yet I think he comes to see more and more that it's not difficult or strange in the sense that it's a sort of alien cultural commitment we have somehow to get our heads and imaginations around. It's recognizing our humanity and learning to be human, that is, learning to live within limit, which means learning to respect the limits of the other and attend to the other for what they are. And God, as you might say, emerges in and through all that. It's part of what goes, or faith is part of what happens when human beings stop trying to be God. And for the Christian, the great good news is that God doesn't want to be God either, in the sense that we often suppose the God we're interested in is not the God of abstract omnipotence and divine qualities and all the rest of it, once again, in that passage you read. So that's the first point I just want to draw out, or first pair of points, that this is a theme going right back to the start of Bonhoeffer's career as a theologian, this interest in encounter and participation, and that sense of encountering a limit, encountering Christ as the one who puts to us a really devastating question about who and what we are. That's in the background of all this. And I suppose that what he's implying in the later work is for us to hear that question about who and what we are isn't necessarily tied to an encounter with, if you like, the Christ that the church presents to people. It will always in some way be an encounter with God in Christ because, hey, that's what's true, that's what's there. But that can come through, that can affect itself in any number of ways. The second point I want to draw out for a moment is to do with that word unconscious. I think you're absolutely right to focus as you do on those passages from Matthew that Bonhoeffer found so intriguing and challenging, that there is a very important sense in which knowing we're doing the right thing is one way of not doing the right thing. And certainly in good Lutheran fashion, clocking up all the right things you're doing is a surefire way of undermining any claim to spiritual integrity. So that's a very deep theme in what he's writing. And again, it's one with profound Lutheran and even, you might say, Augustinian antecedents. It's not just something Bonhoeffer's thought up in the 1940s. But it leaves the question, doesn't it, of whether there's a sense in which the unconscious Christian is almost better off than the religionless Christian in this framework, in that the religionless Christian is still, as you said, looking to Christ as some sort of authority and inspiration. Now, something in me says, I don't think Bonhoeffer could quite have meant that, but there's a little bit of a knot to untie there, I think, because if the ideal is an absolute unself-consciousness about faith, then isn't the conscious pursuit of devotional practice, the prayer and righteous action ideal that he sets up in the prison letters, isn't that almost a kind of compromise of the purity, the Kantian purity of doing it without knowing why? I don't have an answer to that. It's a question that intrigues me. And I think it relates to another question in my mind about Bonhoeffer's intense skepticism about religion. Because I think one has to ask, well, if religion stands for all the sort of cultural carriers of the challenge of Christ that have been developed over the centuries, can we imagine that surviving without any cultural carriers at all? Are we not at some point brought back to religion, to a culture of belief, a set of practices, a set of words, simply in order to transmit it in a human way? Because that's how human beings work. They work in culture and images and words. And I think Bonhoeffer himself is rather caught between two impulses, isn't he? There's the strong, as I might put it in technical, apophatic, the negative theology drive in Bonhoeffer, which says, you know, we're never going to find words. We have to wait on transforming vision and energy being given to us. And yet we can't do without them. And yet we can't just reinvent them or revise them. And that's the tension, the really sort of buzzing, sparking tension that I find in the prison letters, and that makes them so abidingly fruitful and interesting to me and to so many others. And once again, I don't think there's a simple answer to this. I'm not suggesting that you can untangle it in a couple of minutes, but there it is. It's one of the things that I take away from your analysis of all this, and one of the things I've always been struck by in Bonhoeffer. If you're a religionless Christian, are you actually worse off than the unconscious Christian? Or, if you're a religionless Christian, are you, at the very least, in your sort of quiet, almost silent, almost secret fidelity to a tradition of practice, keeping alive something which will ultimately make sense of or give life to what others are living from? And isn't there a role, as he himself seems to grant, in maintaining some sort of Christian culture? And I mean that in the very widest sense. The things you do, the things you say together. Because I suspect that this relates a bit to my third question. I'll try to be brief with it. And that's to do with his own cultural assumptions. He is still, and I think you were hinting at this, he is still working with a model in which there is what you might call a solid core of good chaps around. Good chaps who've been formed in good Christian habits. They may have very sort of sophisticated or indeed unsophisticated levels of distance from traditional Christian practice, but they've all ingested it somewhere along the line. What happens if you're surrounded by people for whom Ayn Rand is more important than the Sermon on the Mount? What happens when you're in an environment where, let's say, particular varieties of either post-humanist collectivism or libertarian conservatism, which are deeply at odds with anything recognizably Christian? What happens when you're in a society where those things are much more popular than they were in the 1930s in Germany, let's say? Because I think he's still working with a fairly optimistic take on the potential of post-Christian society. Now, I've always resisted those who say, oh, Bonhoeffer's much too optimistic in talking about human beings come of age. Didn't he realize what was going on in Germany? Well, yes, of course he realized what was going on in Germany. It killed him. But there's just that hint of truth in that he still thinks, well, at the end of the day, you can recover something of that almost culturally instinctive habit of allowing compassion, generosity and justice to come through. And that's quite a large assumption. It is, as you pointed out, quite a heavily class-inflected assumption. And surely one of the biggest shifts that we've known in the post-Bonhoeffer era is the revival of the rediscovery of theology among those who come from a very different class, social, and for that matter, gender background. The theology of the dispossessed, what Andrew Shanks wonderfully calls the solidarity of the shaken. Those who are beyond that potentially slightly comfortable bourgeois world, the Bürgertum. So what are we to make of that? How do we take that forward? And then just one last observation before I shut up, and that's simply to look for parallels and to look just across the border to Simone Weil, who's in some ways, I think, quite rightly bracketed with Bonhoeffer as one of the great maverick religious thinkers of the mid-century. And for Simone Weil, the essence of goodness is not to think about it. To do what has to be done because it's there. It's a reaction to what is real and what is imperative, which is deeply unself-conscious. It brackets and sidelines completely the fuss and drama of the ego. Here is suffering. I relieve it. I don't stop and think, oh, now why exactly should I do this? Or does this person have a claim on me? I don't stop and think, I do it. I do it as instinctively as I would correct my balance if riding a bicycle. You know, it's that kind of reaction to the world around me. And they, whether you call her any kind of Christian or not, and who knows, she's not an unconscious anything, but she might qualify as a religionless Christian of some sort. They is always interested in the moral danger of being too interested in yourself, your awareness, your consciousness, your motives, your thoughts. And I just want to wonder aloud whether there's some interesting crossover between what Bonhoeffer wants to say about unconscious Christianity and what Weil wants to say about the utterly instinctive and unquestioning impulse towards the truth, which is the mark of real virtue, real moral adulthood and spiritual maturity. And certainly Weil is, I would say, rather better on the class issue and the perspective of the dispossessed than Bonhoeffer is. I would say better. I mean, she's more articulate on that particular subject, comes from that background. But I think there's a crossover, and I think it's one worth exploring. So there we are, Ellie. Just a few thoughts that your excellent presentation sparked for me. Over to you and to the rest of the audience, with many thanks again.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Ellie, can I give you would you like to respond now, or
well, let me just respond very, very briefly, and then I will think more about it and hopefully respond more fully at some later date. But as you were talking, Rowan, just a few things occurred to me. I've really been fascinated by that idea of limit that you brought up in your first point. And I think that what we see in Bonhoeffer, particularly in the Christology lectures that you mentioned, where he says we're not asking anything about Christ. How is it possible to be fully divine and fully human? How does that work? We're not asking the how question, we're asking the who question. Who are you? And as soon as you do that with anybody, you're going into relationship. You're not asking them to give you their background. You're asking, who are you? So that entails relationality immediately. And the way that he thinks about how Adam and Eve limit each other in the Garden of Eden in his book Creation and Fall, I think is really helpful here as well, because he discusses there how they love each other, but they see in each other the limit that God has given them to be to each other. And so there's that constant tension between being drawn together through love and being kind of pushed back on oneself to make sure that you know who you are as you engaged with the other person. There's a lot more to think about there, I think, that is really helpful as we consider how to be as people in the world. And I found it really helpful to think about disability, to think about that limit in terms of disability theology as well. What demands does the other make on us? So it's really helpful to be reminded of that. Yes, the tension between a kind of desire for apophatic theology and also maintaining a Christian culture, and how those two play out. And while you were talking, I was thinking back to the cost of discipleship and how he writes even then about this type of discipleship that he calls hidden discipleship, that you're such a good disciple that you can't tell that you're such a good disciple anymore because you're doing it so well that it just becomes totally hidden to you. And maybe that's a personality thing, because he writes also that he has struggled with pride at points in his life, and so he's really conscious of trying to not let his pride get in the way of his Christian calling. But it's a real question for us and for the church in general. You know, how do we combine those two? So I'll be thinking more about that. And the Simone Weil question, a long time ago, I wrote a paper on sacrifice in Simone Weil and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's such a long time ago that I can't remember what I thought then. But I think there's a really interesting parallel, and you've made me want to go back and read some more Weil. So I'm gonna do that this term. So thank you very much, and I'll think more about your points. Shall we open for questions?
Yeah, I've not yet got anything posted in the chat. While people are gathering their thoughts, could I just ask a very basic non-theologians kind of question? I mean, well, two really linked. One of the things that always strikes me is there's surprisingly little reference when people are discussing the late theology to the actual circumstances in which this is being written. I mean, he's here in a cell, he's witnessing, he's aware of the Holocaust. You know, I mean, the whole horrors are there before him, and yet people can say, well, he's too optimistic. It seems to be quite. I mean, and you, in your book, you talk about the impact on a book, I think it's somebody called Dilthey or something, on the rise of secularism. I mean, why is that significant as opposed to the extraordinary events surrounding him? I mean, the letters and papers seem to make remarkably little reference to what is actually going on. And I'd link that to one thing which always leaps out at me, as I say, as a complete non-expert, is the reference to the weakness of God. The God who in the Garden of Gethsemane says, why won't you stay with me? I mean, this is quite extraordinary the first time I read this, and how that fits with the unconscious Christianity, because this isn't kind of, you know, Christ triumphant. This is the weak, the suffering God. It's not a very coherent question, but it's not from a very informed base.
There's such a lot in what you said, Alan, so many themes. I think the part that we see the weakness of God coming through is when Bonhoeffer writes, only the suffering God can help. There's no sense that appealing to a strong, kind of victorious, battle-ish God is going to help in any way here. Only the suffering God can help. And he develops that in terms of his idea around unconscious Christianity by implying, or by saying, more than implying, by saying that the unconscious Christian is going to be drawn into suffering alongside people in the world and suffering alongside God as God suffers in the world. So that's where that link is, particularly in his poem Christians and Heathens, where there's 3 stanzas, and the first stanza is about what every person does. People go to God in their distress, and they call on God for bread and for succor and for help. And then the second stanza is God goes to all in their distress. Maybe I'm getting the second and third stanzas mixed up. I can't remember.
The third one then is we go to God in his distress.
That's right. Yeah. So in the second one, God goes to everybody, regardless of who they are, and helps them. And then in the third one, the Christians. So there's a demarcation between Christians and other people, and it's the Christians that stand by God in God's distress. And so that, I think, that occurs quite late in the prison texts. I think it's kind of summer 44. And so we get this idea that a kind of key characteristic of Christianity is to suffer alongside God in the world. So that's incredibly important for Bonhoeffer.
Thank you. Can I invite any other questions?
So there's some questions in the chat. I can see another couple of raised hands.
Is there any link between DB's unconscious Christianity and Kay Rayner's anonymous Christians in terms of pastoral and theological meaning? That is from somebody in Korea. I mean, I know that's actually mentioned in the book, isn't it? So I'll put that to Ellie.
Yeah, can I remember what I thought about that? Good question. I haven't read Rana for a long time, so Rowan, if you would like to jump in and say anything, please do. My recollection is reading Rana that he does have a hierarchy of forms of Christianity, and that for him, anonymous Christianity is a good thing to be, but it would be slightly better if you kind of had a sense of what you were doing, I suppose, in your Christian faith. But most importantly, the difference is that Rana thinks that everybody has an impulse towards God, towards the divine, that we're kind of seeking or trying to connect with the divine, whereas Bonhoeffer doesn't think that, because the world has come of age, and some people might not be interested in thinking about God at all. And so there's a key difference in how they think the world works in relationship to the divine. So that's a key theological difference there.
If I can just add very briefly, I think you're right. I think they're trying to answer different questions. Rana is interested in how we know God. What is it in us that gives us the innate capacity for awareness of the transcendent? And I don't think Bonhoeffer is interested in that how question, how we know God. We're back to the limit and the encounter and all the rest of it. So Rana is in that sense getting a rather more abstract point, though he is trying, I think, to do something to soften a traditional Catholic exclusivism by that formulation. But that's not Bonhoeffer's agenda. I'm not saying I think they're incompatible, but they're doing very different things, aren't they?
Yeah, thank you. There is another question in the chat. I know some people are raising hands. It can be quite tricky because there are so many people that you're across sort of several pages of the screen. But first, next, could I go to a question in the chat from Marion Mead, who says, not being a theologian or a philosopher, but a keen fan of Albert Schweitzer, also a Lutheran, but quite a liberal one. I wonder if there is a strong link between the way Bonhoeffer and Schweitzer, in his quest for the historical Jesus, see the meaning of Jesus and our following his example, rather than institutional dogma for our world.
Yes. It was when you were speaking, Ellie, that I was wondering, I'm just reading the Quest for the Historical Jesus for the moment, and I'm just wondering whether not following dogmatic approaches in Schweitzer or in Bonhoeffer, if I understand you properly, is there something that shows parallels between the two? And it seems to me that there may well be. And also thought, as you were talking, I was thinking of Bonhoeffer, and somebody said Bonhoeffer died. Yeah, I think Ron Williams said Bonhoeffer died. He gave his life. He died. And actually, in a way, Schweitzer gave up his life as well. At the age of 30, decided that he was going to enjoy his life until the age of 30 and then give it up for humanity. And I just wondered if there wasn't something similar in their approaches, although he volunteered to go to Africa, whereas Bonhoeffer didn't volunteer to be assassinated by the Nazis. So I just wondered what, it just came to my mind, and I just wondered what you thought. Oh, you might think.
So I'm not extremely familiar with Schweitzer, so that caveat first of all, but I think that there's something about wanting to find out who Jesus is that's perhaps common to both thinkers. So less interested in the hows and the whys and the how should we be thinking about this, how should we be conceptualizing it, but much more who was this person and what does that mean particularly for Bonhoeffer, and what does that mean for for this person's impact on who I am and how I should be? Yes, I don't know enough about Schweitzer's life story to be able to comment on your second point. But...
Wonderful man.
I wonder if I could just add a very brief comment. I think the continuity is that, in a way, Schweitzer, in his quest, really wants to make Jesus as strange as possible.
Yes.
Jesus is not a kind of 19th century humanitarian in fancy dress. He's an apocalyptic prophet who says the end of the world is coming, and he's completely wrong about that. And Schweitzer says, in effect, get used to it. He was completely wrong about the coming of the end of the world. And what you have to hear from Jesus is not a set of moral precepts or a set of theological ideas, but the challenge to be a different kind of person. Like Jesus, to throw yourself onto the wheel of history, whatever the cost. Now, there are all kinds of questions you might ask about that, but I think you can see a bit of continuity between that and the way Bonhoeffer says you don't waste time asking, how can Jesus be divine and human, or was Jesus a nice man, or anything. You are just up against it and challenge the response. I think you're right to see a link there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions in the chat, but Jeff Driver has been waiting to ask a question directly. Jeff.
I was rather going to make a very similar point to the one that Rowan has just made, which is that for me, the great challenge of becoming, well, as it were, involved with Bonhoeffer, as I have been for all my life, since the 60s, Rowan, like you, and what I found was, and it came out several times in what Ellie was saying as well, that the key point for some of us has always been that challenge in the cost of discipleship, in which Bonhoeffer focuses on the question that starts the Beatitudes, who you know, the rich young man who wants to know what it is that will lead him to what he sees as the abundant life. And I find that is the ethical center now of many people in their lives. They're asking questions about that, not about religion in the historical sense as it has evolved. And that is a kind of sociological approach to what Ellie was talking about in different ways. And indeed, I wonder whether that change will continue with forces other than some of the ones we've been talking about this afternoon, like the economics and the environmental and indeed the cultural changes that have taken place subsequent to the last century, I would say. And I wonder if you would like to comment on that.
I was going to leave that one to you, Rowan. It seemed to be more directed towards you.
Oh, well, yes, how long have I got, really? It's a huge question, but thank you, Jeff. I think you're right to say that the question for so many people is exactly, how do I live? How do I live in every sense? Not just how do I conduct myself, but how do I have access to life that is not just empty and fatuous and self-consuming. And I think one of the biggest challenges that the church or any kind of Christian has is that very often we seem to be talking about something completely different from that. And the biggest issue we have is, I think, not mission in abstract. It's trying to speak, as Bonhoeffer himself says, trying to speak about what we believe in a way which suggests that it might have the possibility to transform life. And that's, when he writes about the non-religious language of the future, where it'll be like the language of Jesus, which is not particularly religious, but changes things, changes how you see yourself and what your possibilities are. And that is exactly the great question that believers face at the moment, when frequently the last thing people associate with the practice of the Christian faith is life-giving. Alas.
Thank you. There are a couple more questions, in a sense, which relate to what we've just been discussing. I'm going to take them in reverse order. Janet Cohen asks if Ellie could expand her observation that it can be insufferably patronising to impute unconscious Christianity to those who have consciously rejected it. That must have occurred to Bonhoeffer as well.
Well, one kind of wonders whether he thought that it would be patronising or not. I don't think he was particularly afraid of being patronising, I should say. I think that the problem is obviously that there's a kind of colonizing move, right, that Christians can make, where they go, oh, you think you're of X religious tradition, but actually in your heart you're a Christian because, you know, I have this category of unconscious Christianity that I can just shove onto you because I can analyze how you're behaving, and basically you're the same as me. And that is problematic in so many ways. But so I would first of all want to say that I don't think that that is what is happening in Bonhoeffer's mind when he is starting to articulate his ideas around unconscious Christianity. I think what he's doing is thinking about, first of all, the people in his own life whose goodness, to use his words, these good people, is really evident to him. And he's trying to think through what is happening with these people, and is there something about their spiritual life or about their kind of moral life that I could be thinking about theologically? And so I don't think he's ever trying to say, I'm going to come up with this new category and we're going to be able to, you know, sort out who people are now. But it's more a question for him, right? How am I, you know, what could I think about these people and how do they relate to who Jesus is? The question that's preoccupying him. So I think for us to then take his category and kind of shove it onto people would not be in line with what he's thinking. Yeah, and would be really dangerous.
Thank you. There's another very specific question to you, Ellie, from Nick, and he posted this a little while ago. It says, much time has passed since DB's writings. I instinctively warm to DB's thoughts that we are living in a post-religious age and we need to find a way of telling the Jesus story afresh in a way which is relevant for this post-religious age. But I have yet to have come across a really impressive retelling of the story that is likely to resonate with our times. Here's a question. Have you, Ellie, been impressed by any particular writings in this regard?
No.
Oh.
Yeah, simple answer. I don't know. I don't think so. I could think more about that and see if I can dredge anything up. But off the top of my head, I don't have a go-to. Oh, this person has done a really good job articulating it in X way. I don't know. I can't think of anything right now. Yeah.
Okay. I can't see any more hands waving at the moment. There is one more question, which is a fairly big question again in the chat. It says, can we now speak about only suffering God can help, which is the famous post-Holocaust theological idiom alongside Moltmann and company? Talk about that in a way that is more careful in terms of the orthodox meaning of divine impassibility, which means that only unchangeable God can sustain and help the world. I mean, I think that's in a way putting a lot better what I was trying to grapple at in terms of how the suffering God fits with more long-standing conceptions of Jesus.
So there are lots of people who've tried to either just articulate a theology of a suffering God. Paul Fides, the Baptist theologian, is someone who's done that a lot, and I think done it well. there are some people who have tried to respond to the passages in the Bible where we see God suffering or showing signs of suffering, phrases like the groaning of God, those kinds of phrases, and have tried to articulate, if you like, that evidence that God suffers alongside an articulation of an impassible God, a non-suffering God, and who say that God does not suffer in and of God's self, but that God suffers in a way that doesn't affect God's impassibility, but that is just in the aspect of God that relates to humanity. So there's some kind of responsive suffering going on in God when God kind of is dealing with humanity, if you like, but that in God's self, in a more sealed off, if you like, compartment of God, God doesn't suffer. Thomas Weinandy is someone who's written more along those lines. But I think it's one of these paradoxes in theology, right? You have an impassible, maybe immutable God, and you also have a suffering God. And how do we think about those two things? I'm sure Rowan has thought about this more than I have.
Well, I've thought about it, certainly. Couple of reflections. First of all, there's been quite a bit of criticism of the suffering God formula on the grounds that it can land you in a kind of sentimentality if you're not careful. As if what God has to say to us in a world of suffering and atrocity and meaningless pain and terror is just, oh, I know, you know. And that doesn't quite seem to cut it. Equally, I'm very wary of the dangers of speculating about God's consciousness and saying that God feels terrible about the way the world is. And I'm not sure that quite cuts it either. And when Bonhoeffer says only a suffering God can help, what I hear him saying is partly this. Let's drop for a moment the idea that the most important thing to say about God is that he is transcendent and immutable. Let's drop that and ask, where do we meet God? Answer is, we meet God in the absolute claim that suffering has upon us. But that suffering is human suffering. And we are called by God into a response to that. We meet God in the suffering. Now, I can see that epigrammatically it works much better if you say the suffering God can help. But he doesn't help just by feeling our pain, you know, in the sort of therapy group sense, I feel your pain. He summons us into transformed action by his solidarity with the suffering. Where is God? With the suffering. Where are we going to find him? Going there and doing something. End of. And I don't think he wants us to be speculating about how awful God feels. Well, that's just a thought on reading Bonhoeffer on this, the whole huge metaphysical question that arises. I have a lot of sympathy, actually, with the questioner. We've got to be very careful about just reducing God to an enhanced version of a rather fragile human sensibility, so that, you know, any tears we shed, God sheds more. That doesn't really do for me as a theology of creation or redemption. And I don't think it does for Bonhoeffer at the end of the day either.
Thank you very much indeed. That fascinating exchange makes it even more frustrating that we have actually got to 4 o'clock. I can see on the screen that absolutely everybody, with one exception who had to go, has stayed and has been absolutely riveted. I mean, it has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much indeed, Ellie. It really was a tremendous paper to start with. And thank you again very much, Rowan, for joining us and providing such a stimulating and authoritative discussion. Thank you very much indeed to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And a reminder that we will be posting a recording of this on the Project Bohoeffer website very shortly. And those of you who have not come across Project Bohoeffer before, just get the plug in. If you go to projectbohoeffer.org, the website, you'll find a lot more about what we do. But thank you, everybody, for coming and hoping to make such a successful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.